At 3 in the morning, the peach orchard looked as though winter had returned in a single night. Frost covered the grass between the rows. The wooden fence shone white beneath the moon, and every breath Micah Reed released appeared in front of his face like smoke. The 14-year-old walked slowly between the trees with a flashlight in one hand and a small orchard thermometer in the other. Around 8 young peach trees stood dark plastic barrels filled with water. A thin layer of frost covered their lids. The black sides glistened in the flashlight beam, and the water inside made quiet sounds whenever Micah pressed against the barrels. He stopped beside the first protected tree and checked the thermometer hanging beneath its lowest branches. Then he walked to a similar tree on the next row, where there were no barrels. The temperature there was slightly lower. Only slightly. Micah's father, Terence Reed, held a branch gently between his fingers. The pink blossoms had opened during an unusually warm week. Now their petals looked stiff and glassy. "We won't know until they thaw," Terence said. Micah nodded. The barrels had not created a warm bubble around the trees. Frost still covered the upper branches, and several blossoms had already begun darkening around their edges. But closer to the water, some of the lower flowers looked different. They were cold, but not completely rigid. At the far end of the orchard, Micah's older sister shone another flashlight toward the control row. She called out that the thermometer there had dropped again. The coldest part of the night had not arrived yet. Micah placed his palm against one of the barrels. The outside felt cold, but not as cold as the metal fence post beside it. Then he opened the lid. A thin skin of ice had begun forming along the edge of the water. The barrel was giving up the last heat it had stored during the day. Whether that heat would be enough to protect even a few blossoms remained unanswered. 3 weeks earlier, everyone who saw Micah moving barrels through the orchard believed he was preparing for rain, not frost. Before we return to that first afternoon, subscribe if you enjoy stories about quiet people who test simple ideas when expensive solutions are out of reach. The Reed family orchard stood outside Fort Valley in Peach County, Georgia. Terence had inherited the land from his father, who had planted the oldest peach trees near the farmhouse. Those trees were now being replaced gradually with younger varieties that produced well but often bloomed early. That spring, warm weather arrived ahead of schedule. For several days, the afternoon air felt almost like early summer. Bees moved through the orchard, and pink blossoms opened across the young trees faster than the family expected. Then the forecast changed. A late cold front was moving south. The temperature might fall below freezing after midnight, just when the flowers were most vulnerable. Large orchards in the region had wind machines, irrigation systems, and other equipment designed to reduce frost damage. The Reed family had none of those things. They had a small tractor, an aging pump, and a limited amount of water. Micah began collecting used food-grade barrels from a produce packing facility outside town. He washed them, checked their lids, and rolled them one at a time between the orchard rows. His sister watched him place the first barrel beside a peach tree. "You growing fruit?" she asked, "or starting a barrel farm?" A neighbor driving past on a tractor laughed and asked whether Micah planned to sell rainwater with the peaches. Terence did not laugh. But he was not convinced. "Those barrels will take water, space, and time," he said. "And they'll be in the way when we work the rows." Micah looked toward the blooming trees. "Let me try 8, he said. "We leave 8 more exactly as they are." Terence studied the sky. Then he nodded. "One trial," he said, "and every barrel stays out of the tractor path." Micah rolled the first empty barrel toward the southern side of a young tree. Micah's idea began. During the afternoon, sunlight struck it for hours. One evening, after the air had turned cool, Micah leaned against the barrel while putting away tools. The plastic still felt warm. The wall of the shed had already cooled. The empty metal buckets nearby felt cold. But the water inside the barrel had held part of the day's heat. Micah tested the observation with 2 similar containers. He left one empty and filled the other with water. Both stood in direct sunlight from late morning until sunset. When darkness came, the empty container cooled quickly. The full one stayed warmer much longer. Micah checked them several times through the evening. The difference became smaller as the night continued, but it remained noticeable for hours. Water did not heat as quickly as empty air or thin plastic. It also did not cool as quickly. That was the entire idea. The barrels would absorb solar heat during the day and release part of it after sunset. If the temperature approached freezing, the water would continue giving off heat as ice began to form. Micah understood the limitation immediately. A few barrels could not heat the entire orchard. They might influence only the air and branches closest to them. So he selected 8 young trees with low canopies and placed several barrels around each one. The containers stood mainly on the southern and western sides, where sunlight reached them for the longest part of the afternoon. 8 similar trees nearby remained unprotected. Micah hung thermometers at the same height beneath the branches of both groups. He marked the trees with plain wooden stakes and began recording temperatures shortly after sunset. The first test night was disappointing. The air cooled only slightly, and both groups showed nearly the same readings. The barrels were warmer than the surroundings, but the difference around the blossoms was too small to prove anything. The neighbor stopped beside the orchard the next morning. "Looks like you protected the water," he said. "Not the peaches." Micah continued his measurements. He moved one thermometer closer to a barrel and another farther away. The temperature difference weakened quickly with distance. Close to the water, the air cooled more slowly. A few feet away, the effect almost disappeared. That meant placement mattered. Micah moved the containers closer to the lower canopy, but not so close that they touched the trunks or blocked airflow around the bark. Terence helped him measure the working space between rows. "You can't protect flowers by making the orchard impossible to work," he said. Micah agreed. They left clear paths for people and equipment. During the next cool evening, the barrels showed a small advantage. The air near the lower branches stayed slightly warmer after sunset. It was not enough to guarantee survival during a freeze, but it was enough to keep testing. Then Micah discovered that several barrels would not survive long enough to reach the cold night. The first leak appeared beneath a barrel near the western row. Micah noticed a dark circle spreading through the dry grass. When he pressed against the container, water ran from a narrow split near the base. The crack had looked harmless when the barrel was empty. Under the weight of the water, it had widened. By evening, the barrel was half empty. A second container began leaking the next day. Instead of storing heat, the damaged barrels were creating mud around the tree roots. Micah emptied both and rolled them away from the orchard. Then he found another mistake. He had filled several barrels only halfway because he wanted to move them easily. They warmed faster in the afternoon, but they also cooled faster after sunset. The smaller volume did not hold enough heat through the night. One partly filled barrel became dangerous when a strong wind crossed the orchard. It shifted from its base, rolled several feet, and struck a low branch. The branch cracked near the trunk. Terence stopped the experiment immediately. "A moving barrel can break more flowers than frost," he said. Micah looked at the damaged branch and knew his father was right. He had focused on temperature and ignored weight. Stability and safety. Every barrel came out of the test area. Micah inspected each container in the farmyard. He filled them partially and left them over dry ground to reveal slow leaks. Any barrel with a damaged base or questionable history was rejected. The remaining containers had originally held food products and could be cleaned safely. They were rinsed, closed with tight lids, and placed on level areas of compacted soil. Micah filled them nearly to the top. A full barrel was harder to move, but that was also what made it stable. Terence helped him block the bases where the ground sloped. Nothing was allowed to roll toward the trees or tractor lane. The next problem involved sunlight. Micah had crowded too many barrels around one tree. The containers shaded one another during the afternoon, and several received less direct sun than expected. They also blocked sunlight from the lower branches. Micah reduced their number and changed the spacing. The darkest barrels went where the afternoon sun lasted longest. He also realized that barrels placed too far below the branches protected little more than the ground around them. He moved them closer to the outer edge of the canopy, where rising warmth could pass near the lowest blossoms. After the changes, the temperature readings became more consistent. The protected area still gained only a small advantage, but the advantage remained for longer. Terence examined Micah's notebook one evening. "A couple degrees may matter," he said, "or they may not." Micah nodded. The trees would provide the answer. 2 days later, the Weather Service confirmed a late freeze. The cold front was stronger than the earlier forecast. The barrels had failed during practice. Now the rebuilt system would be tested on the night the family could least afford another mistake. The day before the freeze was sunny and clear. Micah arrived in the orchard early and checked every container. The lids were secure. The bases were stable. The water levels were high. Sunlight struck the dark barrel walls through the afternoon. By late day, the water inside them felt noticeably warmer than the cooling air. After sunset, the sky remained completely clear. There was almost no wind. Those conditions made the orchard vulnerable to a radiation freeze. Heat escaped from the ground and plants into the open sky, while cold air settled into the lowest parts of the property. Micah began checking the thermometers every hour. At first, the protected and control trees cooled at nearly the same rate. Later in the evening, the difference began to grow. It was still small. Near the barrels, the lower branches remained slightly warmer than the matching branches on the control row. Around midnight, frost appeared on the grass. The upper blossoms of every tree began collecting ice crystals. The barrels could not reach them effectively. At the lower level, the result varied from tree to tree. Some barrels had absorbed more sun because nothing shaded them. Those areas held their small temperature advantage longer. Others stood near the edge of the orchard, where cold air moved across open ground. Their effect weakened quickly. Micah checked a tree in a shallow depression. The thermometer there had dropped almost as low as the control row. Cold air was settling around the trunk, overwhelming the limited heat from the water. Terence joined him with another flashlight. "This one is probably going to take damage," he said. Micah looked at the frost-covered blossoms. "I know." They did not move the barrels. Full containers were too heavy and dangerous to reposition in darkness. By the coldest hour before dawn, thin ice began forming inside several barrels. The water was reaching the freezing point. As the first ice formed, it released additional heat, slowing the temperature drop nearby. But the effect remained local. It did not stop frost. It only delayed how quickly the closest branches became as cold as everything else. On the control trees, many blossoms turned stiff. On the protected trees, upper flowers looked almost identical. Lower flowers closest to the barrels appeared less frozen, though no one could tell whether they remained alive. Micah's sister called from the next row. The coldest thermometer had dropped again. The family waited through the final hour. No one lit fires. No one shook the branches. No one sprayed warm water over the flowers. Terence warned everyone not to touch the frozen blossoms. Handling them while rigid could cause additional damage. At sunrise, the orchard looked beautiful from a distance. Every row sparkled. But the frost hid the answer. As the sun rose, the ice melted slowly from the petals. The control trees and protected trees appeared almost the same. Micah closed his notebook. The barrels had done everything they could. Now the family had to wait for the flowers to reveal what the cold had taken. 3 days later, Terence carried a small knife into the orchard. A thin plate of ice floated on the water. Above it, a low peach branch reflected across the dark surface, holding several pink blossoms that had begun to thaw. The barrel had not stopped the cold from entering the orchard. It had simply returned, during the darkest hours, a little of the warmth the sun had left behind.